Okay.
Hello. Thank you all for joining our webinar today on inventory management. We will be discussing the strategies and tools for best-of-breed inventory management. I'm Steve Simonson. I lead the strategy and warehouse consulting practices here at Alpine Supply Chain Solutions. Also with me today are Scott Moon and Gene Tyndall, our inventory experts. While the webinar is active, your microphones will be muted. Please, if you have any questions, post them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring it to then be able to break in and ask those questions for you to our experts. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided today reflects Alpine's opinions and is purely meant to be informational and educational. It does not reflect a recommendation by Alpine in any way. With that, I hand it over to Scott Moon, our presenter.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that, guys. I'm glad for everybody today. We'll be going through a journey today talking about inventory. I have over 30 years experience both in doing and managing inventory organizations, both systems, processes, and the handling and sourcing. And with me today is Gene Tyndall.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Scott. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. And just a quick summary of me. I've been over 30 years in supply chain and both management side, and I was president of Ryder's Supply Chain Solutions for 5 years. Worked with a lot of Fortune companies and lately more middle market ones on inventories and supply chain. So with that, Scott will take the lead here, and I'll be adding color for each topic we talk about. Scott?
Hey, guys, we're going to be taking a journey today. The agenda includes different aspects related to inventory. So we're going to take a little different perspective. We're going to look at it from a customer perspective. We'll then take that and say that based on what customers demand, that results in an inventory policy. That inventory policy then becomes a strategy. And then we'll take that strategy and break it down into its 4 fundamental building blocks in creating that strategy. We'll then talk about the different types of inventory that have to be planned. And then we'll conclude the discussion with some industry insights about customers, what their behavior patterns are, and things that you need to take into account as you think about your inventory policy. As Steve mentioned, this is your time. So if you have a question, please post that to Steve. He'll be monitoring that as we go through. He may stop us from time to time based on questions you may have. We welcome those questions. This is your time. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat box. Let's start. We view inventory a little differently than most people do. So the ultimate in as a customer pleaser is inventory. So customers want, of course, inventory when they want it, where they want it, at a price point they want it. And they're making a lot of trade-offs today. Today, everybody's dealing with a very tough economic environment. Customers are demanding a frictionless environment. So they want an ease of purchase. They want speed of delivery. At the same time, their wallet is strained, so they want premium service at a value dollar. And so if you recognize that and you think through what your strategy is and your commitment and your service level that you're willing to provide to your customers, that will begin to then formulate the strategy that you have to deploy. And based on that strategy, we'll talk about the principles of how you then quantify the inventory levels and your policies to be able to do that. The one underlying point that I would keep out there is that 80% of retail purchases continue to be in physical retail. So while the strains right now in the supply chain are related to e-commerce, the majority of purchases still happen in physical retail. So a lot of the principles that have to be accommodated apply to both e-commerce and physical retail. So just keep that in mind. But the number one priority as a seller is inventory availability when the customer wants it and where the customer wants it.
Yeah, just to reinforce Scott's point, we see some companies where the number one driver of inventory is the customer and their needs. Many companies, though, put it number 2 or number 3, and instead of viewing their company from outside looking in, they tend to view their company as inside looking out. And that's a big difference in how you manage inventory, and especially in these days. And we'll be talking through some of those pros and cons as we go. And I'm mentioning a few companies that we've been working with. So Okay, thanks, Scott.
So as you think about inventory, what we hope you'll walk away from this slide on is, instead of viewing inventory as a necessary evil, we want you to view inventory as a competitive sword. And we want you to align with your senior management team on the strategy they want to deploy, the customer experience they want to deliver. And by doing so, you'll be able to establish an operation and an inventory policy that generates the best and optimal experience for you from a profitability standpoint and from your customers as from an experiential standpoint. Inventory policy will reflect your values. So in essence, strategy is always a value-based assessment process. And in that assessment process, you have to determine the 4 elements that are listed. One is, what are your customers demanding? Is it an experiential thing? Is it inventory availability? Is it a price point thing? And you have to establish what their customer's priority is. From that, you have to understand what your competitive landscape is and what you need to do to differentiate yourself from your competitors. And inventory can be one of those differentiation points. The third is, you need to understand supplier performance, because of course, one of the big parameters in inventory planning is lead time, and your supplier performance, which is their ability to provide what you want, when you want it, based on when you ordered it, is incredibly important. And then the fourth part is you defining from your defined experiential perspective you want to give to your customers. What do you want your supply chain, how you want to be configured? Do you want to have localized inventory, central inventory? All 4 of these become very critical, and you establishing what your inventory policy is.
Yeah, many companies do look at inventory as a cost, and of course it is a cost because you're tying up working capital, but you're also spending logistics on moving it, storing it, and processing it. So it's a cost, but it can't really be looked at as a cost center because it's your revenue generator. And that's the difference in how we look at inventory, especially today, as we're going to be talking about. I mean, some of the measures we have to deal with, everybody knows about turns, but there's a return on inventory capital. There's cash flow generated by how much inventory we're selling, and all these measures now are making inventory even more important than looked upon earlier.
So your values will establish that which is critical for you to invest in. What we'd like for you to walk away from this slide is align with your senior management on what they value, the experience they want to deliver, and the things that they believe are the fundamental building blocks of the future. Those will help you establish the critical building blocks and anchor points of what your critical strategy needs to be. And it will also force you to define what you value, how you value, and where you want to invest the critical dollars that you need to be able to differentiate yourself and run your business. There are 3 aspects of inventory that we want to talk about when we talk about inventory policy. There are 3 tiers. The big bubble, which encompasses everything, is inventory management. That talks about defining your strategy, your priorities, your investments, and things that your customers will value. So when we talk about the strategy, that's in the inventory management tier. When we talk about the tools and techniques you use to be able to then take that strategy, consume it, and then define at an item level and the location level which you want to buy, we call that inventory planning. The final tier is once the purchases have been made and now you're protecting that asset, we talk about inventory control. Inventory control is making sure that what you've invested in doesn't get lost, damaged, or in some way become unsellable. And you do everything you can to protect that and make it available to your customers to be sold. We'll talk in a second about the 4 fundamental building blocks. But those 4 fundamental building blocks that we'll talk about will fall into each of these tiers. So keep terminology in mind. Inventory management, this would equal strategy. Inventory planning equals tools and techniques. Inventory control equals protection and making sure that you do your housekeeping.
Just a quick question came up. Do these strategies apply across all fields of business, or are they specific to a few?
So the topics we're talking about in the way we're describing inventory planning applies to any industry, whether you're a manufacturer, a retailer, a distributor. The principles are all fundamentally the same. We'll talk as we get deeper into the specifics related to the different types of inventory that have to be managed, whether it be raw materials and whether it be buying sub-assemblies or assemblies from a contract manufacturer. But the concepts and principles we're talking about will be consistent regardless of the industry you play in.
Right, exactly. And strategy and planning, it doesn't matter if you're selling through retail or you're selling automobiles through dealers or whatever you're selling. You have a product that you have to manage the levels of inventory and the deployment of it. And we make a point here about 2 points about I want to make. One is on tariff. Everybody's excited about tariffs right now, and that they do impact costs, of course, but that's not necessarily what should impact your inventory, because what you want to do in inventory is meet the customer demands and needs. And if your pricing is correct or reasonable, then and you have the inventory the customer wants and needs, then you're a lot better off than being overly concerned about the tariff and increasing costs. The second point I want to make is what we do on the slide on the bottom. Robust operations reduces profit drains. Basically, if your operations are cost effective, generally your inventory will be managed better. So we're saying you just can't separate inventory from operations. It's all part of the supply chain, obviously, but you need to look at inventory as what really generates the revenue for your company. And hopefully you all are doing that, or will, after you listen to our points here. Thanks, Scott.
So when we talk about inventory management and strategy, typically you're thinking about network. You're thinking about what your customer service level is that you're committing to. And when I use the term service level, I mean order to receipt. So the inventory management or the strategy you're deploying will define how you want to position yourself in the marketplace and how rapidly you want to respond. Once that's established, the inventory planning tools will work through the tiers and through the sophistication of the inventory that has to be available. And each one of those locations or nodes within your supply chain network to be able to manage to the expected in-stock level that you're committing to. Steve, do you have a question?
Nope, we're good right now.
So we talked about the 4 fundamental building blocks. So let's go through those. Everybody seems to have understood and gravitated to working on demand and demand forecasting tools. Safety stock deals with the variability for both demand variability and lead time variability. So the bottom 2 parts of the left side of the 4 building blocks are all around the items that are included in your safety stock tier. The top part are things that you can predict and things that you can measure. So demand and demand forecasting, you can measure your accuracy, and lead time accuracy you can measure. In most ERP systems, everybody is very familiar with updating demand and their demand forecast. What most ERP systems don't require is for you to update your lead time and the seasonality of your lead time. So what's happened is a lot of times lead times are changing over time. And because most folks have basically set up lead times the first time they set up the ERP, what happens is when they get into a period where lead times extend, they run out of stock. And when lead times contract, they have overstock situations. So by managing demand and lead time and its variability, you basically have the 4 fundamental building blocks you need to be able to deal with any scenario you're going to come upon. So let's talk about a few. If you remember, about 18 months ago, there was a blockage of the Suez Canal. The blockage of the Suez Canal affected lead time. What happened, those using the canal had to divert around. And so the vessels that they were shipping on had to go a further distance. And so therefore lead time expanded. If you recognize that and stayed on top of it, you merely would have gone into your replenishment system, expanded the lead time for those items that were flowing on those lanes, and your system would have generated more orders to compensate for the long lead time, and therefore would have dealt with it accordingly. Conversely, during the pandemic, lead times at one point expanded when factories shut down, but when factories opened back up, lead times contracted. And what most folks that failed to do was recognize the contraction in lead time. And what happened was the orders that were placed out there for long lead times now began getting filled at a much faster rate. And so therefore they became over inventoried because the purchase orders that they placed were being filled at a faster rate. The variability components are all around the accuracy of the point estimate that you're using in your forecast. So don't think of in the scenarios that I just talked about, that lead time, either the Suez Canal or in the pandemic would have been in the variability component. It's around, I'm using a point estimate. It has a trend. I'm putting that into my system, and that's what I'm planning with. The variability components are the accuracy of the point estimates that I'm using. So for example, if my demand forecast is only 95% accurate, that means that I have 5% inaccuracy in my forecast, and the business has to make the determination, given the demand variability, of whether they want to invest in incremental inventory to protect that potential loss in sales, or the investment in that extra tier of inventory is too great, and they're choosing to allow themselves to run on certain points. When you think of these four building blocks, particularly in demand, don't think of demand only in terms of individual SKU demand or unit sales. Think of it in a market basket perspective, because a lot of times a customer will buy several items in a basket. And if you don't have one of the items they buy in their basket, they will abandon the basket and go find a retailer or a supplier that can provide the entire basket. So when you think about demand forecasting, there are different levels you can think about. You can think about always in stocks or competitive items that I need always have to stock, and break your inventory into tiers, but always keep that breakage in tiers from a demand forecasting perspective in line with the idea of a market basket.
Yeah, just to add to Scott's good points here, variability has been with us for years, especially on the demand side. And I think Scott's point about how to look at demand planning is a great one. Where we've lately learned a lot about is the supply side about lead time variability, especially those that are operating with 2 or 3 tiers of supply base. What happens in the supply chain, of course, when there's variable lead times from one supplier to the next, is safety stock starts building up. And if you're paying for the safety stock and you do one way or another, then this is raising your cost, for one, of cost of goods sold, but it's also putting that variability right to you where you need the product to get it sold. So I think looking at the supply chain is never going to go away. We've got to fix all the parts that go into what delivers good inventory management. We've had some examples of a couple of companies. I'm thinking about a toy company, Mega Brands, and a footwear company where they were having these problems of lead time variability, not building that into their inventory strategies and having stockouts along for different customer channels, which is the other problem many of you have with the omnichannel. There's different customer channels to serve. So I think the idea here is while we're looking at customers to drive our policies, we've got to look at our supply chain policies and strategies to make sure we're managing that variability properly.
So as we look at this slide, what is it I want you to take away? What I want you to take away is, instead of looking at the world as being totally different than we've ever experienced before, I want you to think of the world in these 4 building blocks concepts. Take what's happening and find the block which is being impacted, and then deal with it within the confines of that block. Everything we've dealt with, from the pandemic and everything else, falls within these four building blocks. So while it may be presenting itself uniquely and may be presenting itself as a unique scenario, the way it would be accommodated in an inventory planning scenario is to adjust one of these 4 building blocks. And by doing so, you simplify the process and you break it down into something that's much more manageable and becomes something that you've dealt with in the past. So let's talk about inventory comes in many forms. And Steve, this goes back to the question that was raised earlier. So whether you are purchasing raw materials to support manufacturing, you're buying finished goods to then redistribute or sell as a retailer, whether you're collaborating and buying sub-assemblies that you then integrate into the final assembly, the key point is to understand sort of the needs of the supply chain, the demand that the supply chain has to support, and more importantly, provide the collaboration between all the people in the supply chain to be able to remove their buffers and their safety stocks, because everybody in the chain is basically buffering from the variability they see from each performer in the chain. By collaborating, you take away all that safety stock tier, which in essence helps everybody to refine their prices, pull their inventory levels down, and be able to share and basically reduce costs and share some of the benefit associated with it.
Yeah, inventory, as Scott said, comes in different forms, and we talk about finished goods, materials, components, ingredients, even packaging is a material. And in some cases, there's work in process. In some cases, we're buying MRO material. So there's a lot of inventories that be managed here, and collaboration is the way we have to do it these days, because if we're not close enough to our suppliers and we're not close enough to our customers, we're really not going to have the information we need to run an efficient inventory program. And let me add to this too. We'd be remiss if we didn't say, once we receive the goods to our distribution center or fulfillment center or warehouse for that matter, we really do need to manage them properly with a WMS or a WES and a WCS. Look at loading and unloading systems, yard management. The whole thing about operating that DC efficiently is so critical to controlling inventory at the point that we've got it, we paid for it, we now have it. What are we going to do with it? And that's so critical to keeping the inventory cost and capital down.
So as we talked about on the prior slide, whether you are a manufacturer, whether you're a supplier to a manufacturer, whether you're a retailer or distributor, everybody has to go through the same 4 building blocks of having a demand forecast for the end products they need to sell, as well as the components needed to go into those end products. They have lead times between themselves and their own suppliers, and they have variability happening in all forms up and down the supply chain. By providing visibility to the end sort of consumption and working your way back and tightening those links in the supply chain through communication and visibility, all partners in that chain benefit and basically enable optimal profitability. What's happened in sort of the evolution from the 1970s onward was an extension of the supply chain. We elongated the supply chain. We moved from shores. We moved from a very domestic sourced and manufactured world to an offshore world where we're manufacturing and using China as our manufacturing base, and now leveraging into Taiwan and Cambodia and some other places, Vietnam as an example. That extension of the supply chain causes inventory in the lead time component to now extend. When you extend the lead time, you're both extending the raw material because it has to traverse a longer distance, and you're extending the amount of goods that have to be procured. That is basically puts strain on the organization and puts a strain on profitability. So by rethinking your policies, not only in how much you carry, but where you get it from and how you source it, and the suppliers you use and the predictability of their performance, you can aggressively go after and reduce your inventory planning processes and your strategy. Inventory is the result of all processes in the organization. If you're looking for the optimal KPI to be able to determine how efficient or inefficient your organization is running, inventory, whether it be turns, whether it be total landed cost, whether it be just total dollar value invested, is a great indicator of the overall performance and the strength of your forecasting methodology, the strength of your logistics and supply chain capabilities, and your ability to basically match demand and supply. So inventory is that indicator that unfortunately Everybody comes, basically says, "Oh, I need to reduce my inventory." Okay, well, it's a collection point. It is the tail end of all activities, and so everybody needs to recognize that they're a player in creating that inventory. They're a player in managing that inventory, and they're a player at keeping that inventory at its minimum.
Yeah, the idea of it, just to reinforce, everybody in the major processes of planning, buying, making, moving, distributing, and selling product is involved in inventory in one way or another. Now, strategy and policy and plans and buying create it, but we all touch it. So I think, to Scott's point, we want everybody in the company to think about inventory as being a key driver of the business and do what it takes to make sure we're all managing that the right way. I can think of all those shoes we worked on, and they were the only people thinking about inventory were sales. And that's not good. And we've had other companies where the only people worried about inventory were supply chain, et cetera. So everybody has to be concerned about it because it affects everything we do, the lead times, the variability and everything we've talked about. And the last point here, I think, to make is what's our stocking locations look like? What are they? DCs, FCs, warehouses, hubs, wherever we're putting stock that we have bought matters, and what SKUs that are going there, the amounts, and why. This is all critical to managing the inventory the way it should be managed. Thanks,
So the
Scott.
market's benefiting from technology advancements. AI is coming on the scene and basically opening up the opportunity to connect small suppliers, small manufacturers to the mid-sized market and the large market, and enabling everybody to work in a digital framework. So AI is being used to basically take, whether it be a PDF invoice, a manifest, whether it be an email confirmation of an order, it's allowing scripts to be written to take that, digitize it, and then consume it within the ERP, to take what was historically very difficult to manage and making it much more readily available from an information and digital standpoint. At the same time, supply chain risk and visibility into risks around the world is the new and burgeoning area that affects inventory. So based on things that may be happening in the store that may just occur today, they have a certain area has a pandemic and they're going to shut down for 30 days. Your AI engine to capture, overlay that to your supply chain, and recognize the impact that just hit your supply chain. You will recognize what you do to either divert to a secondary supplier and or extend your lead time to be able to accommodate that which just affected your supply chain. So technology today is helping the world, and everybody on this phone should recognize its value and embrace it.
Scott, we're having a little problem with your audio. If you could just kind of review that last minute again, that would be great. It just came back.
Yep, sorry about that. What I was saying was AI is an enabler, allowing what had typically been very difficult for small and medium businesses to be able to transact digitally with small, medium businesses and large businesses. It's now enabling that to occur in a very efficient way. On top of that, it's enabling visibility to the supply chain, whether it be transportation, visibility, status, or where loads are. It's allowing people to talk freely and openly and share data in ways that they've never had before. So the point being is AI is an enabler of helping inventory to become a better science rather than a lot of gut feel. I would also go back, and we talked about safety stock. The one big asterisk I would give is don't let gut feel drive your safety stock modeling. Don't let the one time that you ran out of stock and the CEO yelled at you because you were out of stock of a certain product become your inventory strategy. Understand the analytics. Spend the time to develop a robust arithmetic means to determine how much inventory you need to have. Look at your seasonality behaviors. Understand trends of the business, of products, of your competitors, and use analytics to help you model what your inventory levels need to be and be more precise in how you're going to manage your inventory.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just summarize AI and inventory planning as I see it coming. Now, the larger companies are doing most of it because of the expense, but those of you in the middle market, I think, need to track that and see when it's going to be available for you, to Scott's point, to help you do some things better. First is better demand forecasting. We are getting some improvement in AI about predictive as well as descriptive demand. So keep an eye on that. Second is automated replenishment. And to Scott's point, you got to be careful when that triggers replenishment, because it can't be every time you're down to 3 or 4 items or something. You've got to really figure that out. AI needs to be driven. Third is access to insights. Why something happened. We see a lot of companies, well, I didn't know that would happen. Well, how did it happen? AI can sometimes help you with that. And then the fourth thing Scott touched on is faster collaboration and reporting. We need more cross-functional communication. We need communication with our suppliers and customers, and AI is going to be helpful with that as soon as it gets settled down, especially on real-time matters. So keep an eye out for the AI improvements, and as the cost comes down, you may want to start experimenting with it for sure.
So in summary, what do we want you to walk away with in the discussion is, as an inventory professional, you are the great facilitator of bringing all the different disciplines together to understand the power of inventory, understand the power of understanding your customer and their demands, and then taking all that and synthesizing it into a plan, which ensures that you do a couple things. One, you minimize the investment in working capital, which frees up dollars to do strategic things. You enable the business to talk openly and honestly about what they value, what they prioritize, how they want to run their business. And then most importantly, you are the catalyst at being able to drive optimal profitability, because you hold the purse strings to what's bought, where it's put, and how much you need to do and where you need to get it from to be able to keep the business up and running and satisfying your customers. So for you listening to the call, if you're an inventory professional, you are the catalyst. You have the ability to enable the dialogue. Don't sit there and feel the victim. Empower yourself to go and have the right conversations, align with the values of the business, and force the team to talk openly and candidly about what they value and how they want to run their business.
Scott, you want to handle this and I'll color on it?
All right, so right now, every customer is making trade-offs. They're struggling, right? Everybody knows about the decreasing wallet of the consumer and what they're having to do, the trade-offs they're having to make, and the decisions that they have to make. Retailers, if you look at the left side, are recognizing that, and they're recognizing that inventory visibility is a key area of investment for 2025 and 2026, right? They want to minimize how much inventory they're investing in, and so therefore inventory visibility tools are getting sort of their prime, which they deserve. And that could come in the form of container visibility. It could come in the form of ERP accuracy, stock ledger accuracy. But it is a primary focus, and it has C-suite interest. The key thing that you have to recognize as you think about your inventory investment is that the consumer, because they have a smaller wallet, if you will, that they're making trade-offs. So 79% of consumers are trading down by seeking discounts. Now, when we say trading down, that doesn't mean that they're trading down on brands. That means they're trading down on the brevity of the things that they're buying, and they're focusing on the things that they value. Now, a customer could value high value product, so they may basically trade down on buying basic items because they want high quality or high value items. But you have to recognize that their wallet is strained. And the comment I made earlier about evaluating a market basket is even more critical in these times when customers are making trade-offs on what it is they're going to buy and where they're going to buy it from. At the same time, tools are becoming more available and they have more time. So people are shopping instead of going to the mall, walking the mall, or driving from store to store. People are doing more online shopping. They're going to the store. They know what they want to buy, where they want to buy it from. So they have 3 more extra hours to go and do their searches. If you're out there and you're in that market where you're competing, you've got to recognize that you're not competing against just who you think your competitor is. You're competing against an endless aisle competitor. And so you need to think of your inventory and your assortment from an endless aisle perspective, of which many people are doing, Home Depot and the like. Some things are not in the store. So they're providing an endless aisle to compete with the likes of Amazon and other online companies to be able to offer what they want. And the trade-off has to be service. So if you do choose not to have it in physical retail, then you have to recognize that that means you have to have the supply chain that provides a service level that the customer wants or the price that they're looking for. And then the last point on the left is just a recognition that 80% of retail continues to happen in physical stores. That impulse buy, that I want to go get it and put it in today, is still there. And so don't discount that e-commerce is the only way to go, that physical retail is still a place where people are going, although they're checking you, looking online and looking at the endless aisle, that retail sales is growing faster than the rate of inflation. So we're still seeing an uptick in retail purchases, even given the struggle with the wallet, right? So define what your values are, define what your strategy is, define who your competitors are, come up with your inventory strategy, and then use the 4 building blocks and the tools that you need to be able to put that into play.
Yeah, and many of you are with companies that sell through to retail. Some of you are with companies that sell industrial, business to business. And the point we want to make is buyers are buyers. And if businesses are buying similarly to these points about shoppers. I mean, buyers in business want visibility and so forth. So you can go down the same list and say they're behaving like shoppers in many ways. Now we're getting fluctuating order volumes because of the economy and so forth, and that's a variable that we have to deal with, as opposed to the stability that we had somewhat before. But I think you recognize if you're business to business for industrial goods, we talked to someone recently who's feeding a factory um, just in time. That's selling to the company that runs the factory. That's has its same buying behavior because you're trying to meet the customer demands, and you can't allow that factory to go down. So it's a matter of understanding the customers, and these statistics apply to consumer shoppers as well as business shoppers.
So I want to focus on the bottom right bullet in this slide, because it's probably one of the most important things that's said on the slide. Everybody's going through change.
Yeah.
As the enabler in basically bringing the business together in conversation and planning and strategy alignment, change management, and helping all parties recognize how their processes need to change, and being the enabler, not just from creating a strategy and putting in the tools, but more importantly, enabling the change and helping the business to walk through and accept the changes that they're dealing with, will ensure that you have success. So as an inventory practitioner, carpe diem time, seize the day. You're given the opportunity to be a facilitator and enabler of the business. Recognize not only that means more than just aligning vision and policy and tools, it means being a change enabler, and that requires dialogue and collaboration within your business and with your trading partners.
Yeah, Scott and I, having been doing inventory work for so many years, have learned, like with anything else, unless you have a really appealing, attractive, today's interest change management program, something's not going to go right. People will not learn enough. They will not stick with the new processes. So when you take on an inventory improvement process, we at Alpine have the tools to help you with the change as well, because there's new tools out there. No longer are we just doing user training in front of a computer or putting people in a room and talking about what an order is. Today, there's different tools to get people to really change along with the strategy and the tactics of the process. So keep that in mind when you do anything and change. If you really want it to stick and achieve what it was set out to achieve, you've got to build in the change program along with it.
So take away from the slide, focus on people, process, and technology. Keep
Yeah.
it simple. All three elements have to be in harmony with one another. They have to be enabled by a common vision. They have to be enabled by a facilitator that brings people, process, and technology together towards a common goal and gets everybody aligned to deliver on the mission. And again, the result of that alignment will be basically displayed in the inventory that you carry and how much or how little you're able to bring in to be able to sustain your business.
Okay. Any questions? I didn't get any in the chat or in the Q&A, so I'll assume that's no. Our next seminar is going to be unlocking efficiency in the power of slotting in the warehouse, and that'll be on October 22nd of this year. If you'd like to join and register, that will be posted. If you have any questions about anything that was presented today or about upcoming webinars, please get in contact with Paul Gettert. His number and contact information is on here. I'll let that hang up there for a little bit so you guys can take a screenshot of it or jot it down.
Hey, Steve, can I just throw in one last parting comment?
Sure.
We spent the majority of this conversation talking about the forward supply chain, the supply chain that most people recognize. We did not, however, spend any time talking about the reverse supply chain. And the reverse supply chain and its requirements are very different than the forward supply chain, because the reverse supply chain is forced upon you versus the forward supply chain is one that you force upon yourself. We've had a lot of work dealing in the reverse supply chain, whether it be looking at the value of products that are returned, the quality of those, any work that can be done to make them resellable, as well as the distribution strategies from the reverse supply chain. Returns continues to be a huge profit drain for all organizations. Alpine has the ability to add value, not only in the forward supply chain, but in the reverse supply chain. And I would talk to most folks on this call, if they're in inventory, looking at dead inventory, looking at obsolete inventory, looking at returned inventory. That's a tier that if they can aggressively attack, will help them eke out considerable profitability for their business.
So we just had a late question come in. How would DOM or OMS help with this inventory strategy?
So an order management system, I assume that's what they're using when they say OMS. Everybody uses acronyms a little differently, right? So
yeah,
but an order management system is basically the reason why you have it is to be able, if you're talking about customer orders, is to be able to define a back order situation. That's really its key value, is to determine how you're going to handle a back order situation. All that really does in that scenario is tell you how much of your future demand has already been sort of spoken for, if you will. And it gives you the opportunity from a supply standpoint to recognize you might want to be more aggressive at the supply you're buying because you may be over consuming. So an OMS gives you that ability to manage sort of that phase of it. I don't know, Gene, if you have perspective on that.
Just to add that a robust OMS will route the order to the proper DC to fill it to. So that's what it's doing. It's handling your customer orders basically. And
That's a DOM. So let's talk a little bit about a DOM for a minute.
right, but OMS could be a DOM as well. Go ahead.
Yep. So to answer the question from a DOM perspective, law of large numbers. So the more you fragment your demand, the greater the variability that you'll have in each of the pockets that you're trying to plan for. The more you keep that demand consolidated, the less variability you'll have, and so therefore the less inventory you'll have. The organization and that's why we said strategy is important, has to determine the trade-off between inventory optimization, the use of DOM and OMS to be able to distribute from essential supply, and the service level and the cost thereof that they're willing to spend to be able to deliver on whatever commitment they're making to their customers. Let me say that again more simply. You're either going to buy more inventory and have more distribution locations to have a short SLA, or you'll pay more transportation costs to distribute from a central location where you'll have less inventory. The business has to determine which costs they want to optimize and what they want that balance to be. Tools can help you do that. A DOM can help manage how to route it where you have supply. An OMS may include a DOM, but it may not. But it also provides the ability to manage back orders and prioritize how you want to allocate unlimited supply. But it is your strategic values that determine what your network will be and what your service levels are, and then what your costs are associated with delivering on all of those. And that comes together in your inventory strategy.
Yeah.
All right. One last question. Do returns have an effect on the process? What can we do to control this in this volatile world?
Great. That's a great question. And that's one that everybody is grappling with. The first question is to understand why the return is occurring, right? So there are a couple of trends that are happening. One trend is because returns are so easy, a customer may go buy all colors of a style because they like the style and they're not quite sure which colors they want, right? And they may then send back, if they have 8 colors, they may send back 7 of the 8 and only keep 1, okay? So the question becomes, you have to understand their behavior. You have to try to curb their behavior while giving them what they want, which is flexibility to buy where they want from, right? So there's a balancing act you have to do there. And the question becomes, what are your values? Do you value the customer? Are you willing to accept those costs? And some of the creative strategies that people are doing is evaluating the quality of the goods and determining whether that order can be rerouted in transit, as opposed to coming all the way back to a fulfillment center to be sorted and then redistributed, right? So it's what is your customer strategy? How do you want to deal with your customers? What do you allow them to do? And how do you manage and control them because people are going to abuse it. So you have to create policies that catch abuse and minimize abuse.
Yeah, there's some different kind of strategies being discussed. One is to charge for returns, and I'd say be very cautious about that. When you can take it to UPS and not pay a thing, you don't want people to have to pay for a return. Now, maybe you put some penalties on excessive returns, like Scott mentioned. I've seen a few of these with the big box stores, but different strategies are being looked at because it is a high burden of cost and effort for a lot of companies that get so many returns all the time.
Again, a customer that you have is easier to keep than trying to find a new customer. So part of that could be your pricing strategy. If you're in retail and you're selling through an online store, talking to the retailer and putting in some provision of what your price will be to compensate for some of the expected returns. There are ways financially to deal with this, but it's got to be a value statement, and it's got to be a reflection of what your strategy is and how you want to manage your customers.
Yeah. And of course, each product will have to make a decision about is can it be refurbished and resold, or can it cannot be repaired or refurbished and resold, it has to go somewhere else, and how you dispose of it, to Scott's point. And do you give it away to charity and take a write-off on your books? Do you sell it to a discounter and let them take it and price it down? You have so many choices, but it's hard to decide, but you've got to do that rather than incur the cost of processing every one of them the same way.
The point I was trying to make is Alpine has the capability, as we've talked about during the discussion, to deal with the forward supply chain.
Yeah.
The issues are similar yet different in the reverse. So I don't want to leave that out, because the reverse is typically a much greater drain in profitability than what the forward can provide. So managing both ends of that is critical to ensuring you're optimizing your profit opportunity.
Yep. And it's part of managing your inventory for sure.
All right. No other questions at this point. All right, I would like to thank everybody for joining. Again, our next webinar is on October 22nd, and that will be on slotting. So if you'd like to join that one, please go to alpinesupplychain.com and you can register there. All right, thank you again for joining, everyone.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
all. Thanks all.